Good evening. As I said to you this morning, we're going to be looking in the book of Acts. And what I want to ask of you is that, we go back to doing a Bible class. And so I'm going to put my phone up here. So if there's anybody at home that's watching that wants to make a comment or a question in class, by all means send that to me, and I'll entertain those and try to fit them into our lesson. And of course, anybody here in the auditorium that might have a question or a comment, certainly we'd be glad to have that as well. Last Sunday night was a special thing because I had about 13 weeks of content to squeeze into one lesson. We don't have that kind of pace tonight. We're much more relaxed tonight. So comments and questions are certainly welcome in that. Tonight we're going to start in Acts chapter 25. And that's where we're going to be. But I want to catch you up. It is, after all, since March since we've looked at this study. And so I don't expect you to remember everything that has happened. But the book of Acts, of course, is certainly the life and times of the apostles Peter and Paul. Those are the primary figures in the book. And starting when Paul is converted in Acts chapter 9, most of the rest of the book is about Paul, with the exception of chapters primarily 10, 11, and 12. And then 15 is the group where they come together in Jerusalem. But most of the rest of the book is the life and the journeys of the Apostle Paul. We know Paul had 3 missionary journeys that we have recorded. And those 3 missionary journeys have already taken place by the time you get to Acts chapter 25. So he has started all the congregations he's going to start. He's preached to most of the places he's ever going to preach. And he has spent the biggest part of his life in proclaiming the gospel. And so in chapter 21, and I want to start there in 21, we'll just skim through some things to get to 25. But starting in 21, Paul finishes his 3rd missionary journey, or he did right before that. And he's on his way to Jerusalem. While on his way to Jerusalem, he has met with, in the end of chapter 20, the Ephesian elders and talked with them and warned them about what was going to happen in the church in Ephesus. And then he goes on to go to Jerusalem. And so he arrives at Caesarea, as it points out in chapter 21 in verse 8. He comes to Caesarea. Caesarea is where Philip was. Philip was the one who had preached in Samaria, and then later on Philip was the one that ended up in Caesarea after having converted the Ethiopian eunuch. And so Philip's in Caesarea, and it's a little while later that Peter goes and converts Cornelius, and Cornelius is in Caesarea. I think it's God's providence that God sent Philip to Caesarea, because the church would be established once Philip got there, and shortly thereafter, a Roman centurion, which we know as Cornelius, was going to be converted and then undoubtedly would be a part of that church there. And so Philip apparently spends the vast majority of his preaching in Caesarea, because that's where we are before Paul begins his missionary journeys. Paul has all of his missionary journeys, and on his way home, on his way to Jerusalem, after the 3rd missionary journey, he goes to Caesarea, and Philip's still there. And so they meet there on his way down to Jerusalem. And so he spends some time with them, and Agabus the prophet comes up and tells Paul and all of them that you're going to be put in chains and bound, and lets them know about all that's going to happen. And so they have a very tearful goodbye and Paul goes on to Jerusalem. While in Jerusalem, he meets with James, the brother of Jesus, and spends some time with him and is with them. And after that, the end of chapter 21, Paul is arrested. He's arrested at the end of chapter 21. And this is, of course, a very contentious thing that he's arrested. They think he's a traitor. They think he's whatever. And so they are ready to kill him. Well, the authorities catch hold of him and keep him from being beaten. He asks to speak to the crowd, and he does. He addresses the crowd in chapter 22, gives a lesson as to what he is about, who he is, tells them that he's a Jew, tells about where he's from, and also in chapter 22, the Apostle Paul gives his own words to his conversion. Chapter 2 is a very valuable chapter for that reason, because you have the conversion of the Apostle Paul in his own words. And why is that important? Because what you realize is that here the Apostle Paul saw Jesus on the road to Damascus and was blinded by the vision. He heard the voice of Jesus, spoke to Jesus, and heard back from Jesus. Was led by the hand into Damascus. There he prayed for 3 days and nights. And upon the end of that time, Ananias came to him and told him in verse 16 of Acts 22, "What are you waiting for? Arise and be baptized, washing away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord." So he was told, after seeing Jesus, after speaking to Jesus, after praying and after fasting, after doing all those things, he still had to get up and get his sins washed away. So seeing Jesus, speaking to Jesus, praying and fasting, none of those things forgave Paul of his sins. And you know what? It's not going to forgive anybody else's sins if they're not a Christian. It was only upon completing all those things, by being baptized in submission to the will of God, that he was able to be a part of God's people. And so that's why chapter 22 is very important. And after he's arrested in 21, the entire rest of the book is about Paul being in custody. And so the book even ends with him in Rome in custody. That's how it ends in chapter 28. But so he gives his defense here in 22 before they take him into the barracks. They're letting him, which is kind of unusual, they're letting him make a statement to all the people before they haul him off to jail. Instead of making one phone call once he got to jail, he gets to preach to them before they take him in. And so that is what takes place in chapter 22. In the end of chapter 22, the Apostle Paul is before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin don't like what he has to say, and he's before the high priest in chapter 23, and it all is going poorly. They want to kill him. They want to execute him. In fact, in chapter 23, a plot is discovered that there are some men, that there are 40 men that have decided they're not going to eat or drink until they kill Paul. And so what they're asking to do is have him moved. And so that on the way they were going to kill him on the move. And so this plot was found out by a family member of Paul's. Apparently his sister had found that out. And so his sister told her son. And that son went and told the tribune after telling Paul. And so, what do? The Roman guard take Paul in the middle of the night, and they leave and they go to move Paul to where the governor is, to Caesarea, in the third hour of the night. At midnight, in chapter 23, verse 23, the tribune there in Jerusalem says he called 2 centurions, and he says, get ready 200 soldiers and 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen and go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. So here in midnight, they send Paul with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. So that's, you do the math, that's 470 military people to guard a preacher. And these are Roman soldiers. These were not just anybody. These were some of the most feared soldiers in all of human history. And there's 470 of them escorting Paul. Must have thought Paul was awfully dangerous. Or that what might come to Paul was awfully dangerous, you might say. And so they go off at midnight. Now, people didn't travel much at midnight, and of course, certainly don't even now. But at that time, that would have been something to have seen. Could you imagine being, just for a moment, if you were a goat herder and you were out there camping along that road, and all of a sudden that came by in the middle of the night, along the road, you'd probably think, wow, what happened? To hear that many horses and to hear that many soldiers running along in the middle of the night. And certainly would have been something to have beheld. Well, they get Paul out of there and send him to Caesarea. What's interesting about Caesarea? That's the one place he stopped on his way to Jerusalem. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder, because Paul's there in Caesarea a long time. He's there over 2 years, we find out, through the course of the rest of the next few chapters. He's there quite a while. And so undoubtedly, the brothers and sisters there in Caesarea would have been able to help him, encourage him, and be there. It might be part of the reason, whether he knew it or not, but might be part of the reason why Paul stopped in Caesarea on his way to Jerusalem. Because those people were going to be involved and engaged in his life and helping him and his ministry while he's there in Caesarea. And so he goes to Caesarea. The governor there is Felix. He is the governor at the time in that area. He is a Roman and a Roman soldier and the governor over that region. And so the charges get brought to him, and Governor Felix is now the one that has charge of Paul. The reason why that's an important thing, because the Jews wanted to kill him, and the Jews wanted rid of him. And so even though he's in the big house, being under Roman guards in the big house, and he's definitely, it's a double-edged thing. He's definitely secure, but it goes both ways. Nobody, especially the Jews, are going to try to break into a Roman stronghold and overtake the Romans. That was not going to happen. So as long as Paul was under Roman custody, that was a safety thing for him. In chapter 24, when Paul is there, he's there guarded, and come to chapter 24, verse 1, after 5 days, after Paul was there, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and the spokesman, one Tertullus, and they laid before the governor their case against Paul. When they had summoned Tertullus, began to accuse him, saying, and to make the accusations that Paul has made of trying to stir up riots and trying to cause problems in their government. And so Felix, to make the story short, doesn't want to do anything to upset the Jews, but he's not really particularly thinking that Paul is a problem. And so he does not want to have a problem with the Jews, and so he holds on to him and keeps him in custody. Interestingly enough, in verse 22, after Paul speaks before Felix, in verse 22 it says, but Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. You see, Felix decides that, of course, he knows about the way, he knows about the church. Of course, that's what the church is often called in the book of Acts. And so he knows about them. And so he does not want to be against Paul, but he also does not want to be against the Jews. And so he simply holds on to Paul, and he kicks the can down the road and says, when the tribune comes along, we'll decide your case then, to give him a chance to figure it out. You see in verse 24 and following that after some days Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ and reason about justice and self-control and coming judgment. Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. The Apostle Paul made an impact on Felix. He scared him. He talked about things he didn't want to hear. He reasoned with him about righteousness, self-control, and judgment. You know what? Those are three subjects that scare every politician, don't they? You start talking to politicians about righteousness, self-control, and judgment, and you'll get ushered out of the office in a hurry. You know, those are not things that politicians like very well. And of course, Paul preaching that to Felix, it scares him. This Roman governor is scared. And you think about the roles. Paul is in chains. Paul is a prisoner. The prisoner scares the governor, the one who has all power in that situation. You know, as long as the Roman Caesar didn't override him, he had all the power he could imagine in that region. And so he could say and do just almost anything and everything he wanted to do. But those two people, one being in chains and the other one being having all the power, but the one that walks away scared is the one that thinks he has all the power. And so what an amazing thing that is. And he makes one of the great statements, and if you use the King James, he says, when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you. What an interesting thing that is. I will tell you that there are people all over this planet that are looking for a convenient season to answer the call of the gospel. But you know one thing that happens? A convenient season almost never happens. Why? Because Satan will make sure it doesn't happen in your life. You see, because it's never convenient to be a servant of Christ. Oh, when you stand before God someday, you'll realize it was convenient, a lot more convenient than you might have thought. But in this world's standards, in this world's estimation, it'll likely never be convenient. And so he wanted that. A window into who he was, that in verse 26, at the same time he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. And so he sent for him often and conversed with him. He wanted a bribe from Paul. And maybe he wondered if, Paul stayed there long enough, his followers would gather up money and pay to get him out, that they would pay a ransom or something. So maybe that's what he thought. But no, that's not what happened. Verse 27, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So for 2 years, Paul is in prison in Caesarea, basically waiting to be on trial. It's one of the reasons why our government has as one of the things that is important is that we have a speedy trial or access to a speedy trial. It's not quite so speedy anymore. Sometimes it can take months or years, but That's what it's supposed to be. For 2 years, Paul waited. He has not been convicted of anything, mind you. And he's held in prison. Verse 1, chapter 25. And we won't be long in this chapter, so don't worry. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. And they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning to ambush and kill him on the way. You see, they haven't given up on this. They tried to ambush and kill him in Jerusalem, and they sent him away. And now 2 years have elapsed. You'd think they'd give up, don't you? You'd think they'd quit worrying about Paul. But no. They try out the new man, Festus, who has now just been there 3 days. He doesn't know who all the players are. He doesn't know what everybody's angle is. And so the chief priests, they come up, the principal men of Jerusalem, and say, we would like for you to bring Paul down to Jerusalem, and we'd like to put him on trial. All so that they can ambush the group and kill Paul on the way. Verse 4. Festus replied that Paul was being kept in Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. And so he would be going to Caesarea, to where Paul was. And so he's now the new governor and going to take care of that matter. And he said, if you've got something, you come there. Go up there. I guess it's providential. I guess it's something that he did know a little bit about what's going on in order to know that Paul going down to Jerusalem was not a good idea. And so they go and they get ready to put him on trial. Verse 6. And after he stayed among them not more than 8 to 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of Moses, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? You see, Festus and Felix, the man before him, neither one had a backbone to stand up to what the Jews were trying to do. They were playing the politician card. They were trying to keep the Jews happy while not really doing anything to Paul. They didn't really want to harm Paul, but yet they didn't want to upset them. And so they're just trying to play all things against each other. And so Festus is trying to ask Paul, so that it wouldn't be his fault, it would be Paul's idea. Paul, do you want to go up to Jerusalem and face these charges? But Paul, being too smart for this, says in verse 10, but Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. That's a good answer. You know, I'm already standing in front of Caesar's court. You are Caesar's official. This is already a higher court than going to Jerusalem. You know, you don't go to a lower court. You go to a higher court. I'm already standing before Caesar's tribunal. He says, to the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself very well know. If I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if nothing is to their charges against me, no one can give up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." What happened there? I mean, this is a class, and what happened? Anybody have a...
He never examined me, he just accused him.
Okay, the Jews accused him, and then, of course, Festus kind of throws out the accusation. And so there's been no witnesses, there's been nothing except for just blatant and false lies. And Paul really hasn't had much chance to defend himself. And so, there's these things been leveled against him. And Paul said, I'm already standing in front of Caesar's court. I'm already standing in a higher court than going down to Jerusalem. And they've already made up their mind down in Jerusalem. I know how that's going to turn out. And so he says, if I deserve to die, I'm not going to fight that. But if there's nothing against me, then let nothing be against me.
But the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen allowed him to appeal to Caesar.
Okay, that's where we're going. And what does that mean to appeal to Caesar? Now, let's talk about the Roman citizenship. Not everybody was a citizen. Not every Roman was even a citizen. You had to either be born as a Roman citizen, as in born into their class that allowed them to be citizens, or you could buy Roman citizenship. And so, Paul, when he was born, was a Roman citizen. We find that earlier in the book of Acts. And undoubtedly why he was born into that, because he was a Jew, the only way he was in that is his dad had to be very wealthy. His dad had to have bought it in order for him to have been a Roman citizen, because a Roman, you're not born a Roman citizen as a Jew unless your parents are Roman citizens. So the only way that could happen for him is for his father or a grandfather or someone along the line to have bought that Roman citizenship, and therefore when Paul was born, he became one. And so what is Paul doing here? He as a Roman citizen, had the right to appeal to Caesar. And what does that mean? Well, he's making an appeal to the highest court. He is doing essentially what happens in our country. If you take someone to court in our country, maybe it is you got a dispute in some way, and it may go to court, it may go to a state court, and in that state court there may be a decision made, or maybe the decision isn't made. Maybe the decision is too hard and doesn't get made. Well, it can go to a state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court may struggle with it, and they bump it up to a federal court. There are regional federal courts around our nation. And if the regional federal court can't deal with it, or they make a decision that nobody really likes, it can eventually go to the very top, and that's the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court is the top court in our country. And the U.S. Supreme Court will get only the most difficult cases. Only the most difficult, challenging, far-reaching cases that maybe change laws, maybe change so many things. Those are the kind of things they decide. They never were intended to be a legislative body, but it happens that way sometimes because they interpret laws that the House and the Senate have passed and the President has signed on. It's one of the checks and balances put into our system. That one system, as in the legislative branch, makes laws, and then the judicial system determines whether those laws that were made are right or not. And so, anyway, it takes a long time, many, many years, and many, many court cases to get to the U.S. Supreme Court. It is a big deal to get your case to the Supreme Court. It does not happen often. It is one of the remarkable things about the Roman system of government that an individual citizen, they had the opportunity to appeal to Caesar. And what that means is, I want my day of judgment before Caesar himself. That's pretty amazing. Now that is a really amazing thing for any society. There are all kinds of problems with the Roman government, but that was one thing that was a really big thing, that Roman citizens had the opportunity to appeal to Caesar, say, I want my day before Caesar. Now the problem is, if Caesar doesn't like what you had to say, there's nobody to appeal to after that. You're toast. It's a pretty big roll of the dice in a way. If it doesn't go well for you before Caesar, then you're sunk. Such things as fighting the gladiators and lions and that kind of stuff can happen. It can be kind of scary, but he makes an appeal to Caesar himself. This is a great decision that Paul makes. And it's a decision that will guide the rest of the book of Acts as he is taken to Rome to eventually stand before Caesar. Something I want to say here. When you look at Paul's writings, and you'll notice that Paul did not jump into political things. In fact, Paul would say that we should follow the governing authorities and whatever. But Paul did use his Roman citizenship to his advantage in this instance. And to another time when he was going to be beaten, and he made the comment that, do you beat Roman citizens without a trial? He used his political system that he was in. And so, while I don't know that we as Christians need to be totally wrapped up in politics, but sometimes for the cause of Christ, we can use the political system to bring about something good. And Paul did that on those couple occasions. I think that's important to note that Paul did use his Roman citizenship. It's not the citizenship he valued most. It was being a member of the kingdom of God that mattered most. But he did use that Roman citizenship when it helped him and helped the cause of Christ. And so I think that's important to note. The end of the chapter, the last few verses. King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, comes to, and of course he's the Jewish king, was much more of a figurehead. Although he did rule over the Jews, he was more of a figurehead because it was still the Roman government that was in charge of everything. It's just that Agrippa kept the Jews in line. But anyway, he had come to visit with Festus. And they stay together. Well, Festus knows that the man he's sending off to Caesar, Paul, is a Jew. And so he asks Herod what his thoughts are about this. And he said, because Festus is in a spot. Festus is going to send Paul to Caesar, but he's not got anything to say. Other than that the Jews babbled a bunch about this and that, and there's nothing there to accuse him of. And so he says, I need to put something down. I need to write something down because I can't just send this man to Caesar without some kind of charges brought against him. And so he says that to him, and he says that to Agrippa. And they said, well, I would like to see him myself, Agrippa does. Verse 22, and then Festus says, tomorrow we will do that. And so that is what they do. At the end of the chapter, you find out that King Agrippa and his wife, Bernice, they come in with great fanfare, with great pomp, and they come in before there, and there's Festus, and they bring in Paul the very next day. And so he can't find anything in verse 25 of chapter 25. I can't find anything with him deserving death. He's appealed to the emperor, and he says, I decided to go ahead and send him. And he says, I needed to write something. And so, anyway, he wants to know what Agrippa thinks. And so, that is what takes place. So, chapter 26 is where we're going to be next Sunday night. Now, I will tell you, chapter 26, 27, and 28 are more exciting than 25. 25 is probably one of the slowest, if not the slowest chapter in all the book of Acts. It just is. So, 26, 27, and 28 are pretty exciting. A lot of neat things in those. Really, the whole book is that way. It's just that 25 happens to be kind of slow. But anyway, we'll be in chapter 26 next week, and it'll be Paul standing before Agrippa. And that's what we'll look at. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, we want to give you the opportunity to become one, to give your life to Christ. Or if you want to be returned to the Lord and come back to Him, we want to give you that opportunity. But if we can help you in any way to get your life right with God, we'd be glad to have you do that. If you are watching online and you want to respond by text or an email, by all means do that. If you're watching us randomly on the internet, you can send to our email address. We'll give you that, barrickvillechurch@gmail.com. Pretty easy to remember. And you can message us, and we'll be glad to study with you and talk with you about what it takes to become a member of the body of Christ. If you want to respond in a public way at this time, would you please come while together we stand and sing.